I was just going to read what you have on the website.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I wonder what's there.
Okay, all right. All right. Dr.
We'll
Robin
find out.
Faith Walsh is an assistant professor at the University of Miami. She earned her PhD at Brown University in Religions of the Ancient Mediterranean with a focus on early Christianity, ancient Judaism, and Roman archaeology. Before coming to Professor Walsh taught at Wheaton College in Massachusetts, the College of the Holy Cross, and received teaching certificates in pedagogical training at Brown University and Harvard University. She teaches courses on the New Testament, Greco-Roman literature, and material culture. Her recent offerings at include Introduction to the New Testament, Jesus in Myth and History, Paul, Letters and Controversies, the Greco-Roman Context of Early Christianity, the Bible and Film, Religious Issues in Death and Dying, Religion and Sports. Professor Walsh also teaches in Miami's Rome program at the American University, which I think you're going to soon, right?
Yeah, although now I'm not going.
Oh,
but you're still giving a guest lecture. Yeah, it's a long story, I'll tell you.
Okay,
But,
right.
yeah, but
Okay.
yeah, I usually teach a couple of weeks every year over there,
Okay.
which is it was a
pretty
program
fun.
that existed before I came to but it works for me because I study ancient Rome, so that makes it pretty
Yeah.
pretty convenient to go over there. Yeah, that was a fairly accurate. Yeah, I mean it's my history, my educational history. So, but yes, my expertise is in the ancient Mediterranean, text and material culture. I was saying to George before, I'm worried about the material culture bit because when you're in graduate school, you study all these things and they seem like they're part of who you are, and then you get a job somewhere in a particular subject, and then as the time goes on, you realize you're not working as much. And that, especially if you have two subjects that you're working on. So I still publish in archaeology, but I haven't been out in the field in a long time. But I am going to talk about material culture today. And it sounds like the previous speakers you have talked about material culture as a language as well. And so what I wanted to do today is talk about the medium of language, both in terms of text and material culture. As it pertains to early Christianity and early Christian narratives, but specifically, and this is a little bit difficult to get at, but I think there's a degree to which, especially with something like early Christianity or Christianity in general, we think of it as exceptional in its time, because if it wasn't exceptional, why would anybody care about it? Why would anybody want to follow a new religious movement if it wasn't somehow designated as exceptional? But the problem with that is that language and any cultural cues, what some scholars call translation fables, have to come from somewhere, because you need to relate to somebody, translate to somebody that certain images, concepts matter and that they're significant. But usually those codes already pre-exist somewhere out in the ether. And I've been trying to think of a good example of this with my students all semester. And maybe you can help me think of a better one. But I'll give you some examples. I'll give you one from early Christianity that I'm going to talk about today, and then maybe you can help me think of a modern example. But the empty tomb, right? So all of you, it helps for me to hear where you're coming from, because you all more or less have an idea of the Christian narrative, right, in the story of Jesus. So that's very helpful, I hope. But his tomb was empty, that he resurrects. When they see his empty tomb in the Gospels, they automatically know that that means he's become a god, or that he's divine in some way. They know that because almost every Greco-Roman deity, the body disappears, or the tomb is empty. Or something happens with the dead body that after 3 days they realize the tomb's empty, the body has left the tomb. This was a cultural code that already existed. Does it mean Jesus isn't special? That's kind of not the point. The point is that as a reader, as someone exposed to this narrative or exposed to this language for the first time, they would automatically know, like, oh, okay. Because it has to come from somewhere. You can't just out of thin air invent some kind of, you can innovate and you can change things up. And it's that particular combination that early Christianity creates of what's called paradoxography, so interest in like supernatural things, an interest in this teacher, Jesus, who's also a wonder worker. It was just the right combination of things at the right time that people were interested in, but with these cultural codes along the way that signaled, like, oh, okay, now I know who this person is. I know they're exceptional. I know this is important. And we see this in text and we see this in art. And so when I say I've been trying to think of a modern equivalent, the closest we've been able to come to in my Greco-Roman class is there are certain cultural codes with like, the Marvel universe, right? Like almost all of these superheroes have certain qualities in common. And if something happens, you know exactly what it means. Or like when there was the whole Twilight, like werewolf, vampire, like all these stories kind of had similarities and overlap. So these stories do the same thing. So one thing I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about why we tend to think these stories are exceptional, how that has skewed our interpretation of these texts, and then some of the work I've been doing and some of the work that's out there on how to resituate these narratives within their cultural setting and their literary setting. Now, when I was saying before, I was ready for anything. I wasn't sure if I was going to be behind a podium, just like talking at you, or if I was going to be, walking around a room, or how much time I had. So I am ready for anything. I apparently have 117 slides. I will not expose you to all 117, but I thought if I have to go to 1 o'clock, I better have something in the tank. And I do like it, like you don't have to wait until I'm done talking to ask me questions or ask me to clarify so please, I like it more, and it's fun for all of us if we're learning from each other, so please just hands up or just speak out loud. Don't hesitate, it won't bother me if you do that at all, or I can just carry the weight, whatever happens. So I'm open to a dynamic room.
So I think we can go for an hour or so?
Sure.
Does that work?
Yeah, so it's 10:20 now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll talk through some of the evidence, and then we can see where the conversation goes. Okay?
I think that's the most fun, is the conversation.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more fun, and I can still get to the content. Like that's the job.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know the material, so I'll figure out a way to get there. But before I start, are there any initial questions or anything for me?
My first question is religion and sport. I wanted to just ask what's
What am I teaching there? I co-teach it with the head of my department, and he teaches about new religious movements in the 20th century, so I sort of handle the ancient stuff. So how were athletes viewed in the ancient world? How did they train? And especially in the Greco-Roman context, they become gods, a lot of them. If you win enough Olympiads, yes, yeah. If you win enough of those, you're going to get a statue after you die, and people are probably going to do some sacrifices to you, and if that goes well, just sort of builds and builds, because you're an exceptional human being, right? So I tend to teach that. I teach about gladiators as well, because there are a lot of overlap, especially my favorite example of this is gladiators. They used to bottle their sweat and their blood. And the sweat was used as an aphrodisiac. So women would buy it as a perfume. Yeah, because they were considered so manly and virile that. And so then I always put that up on the screen with like a picture of, like Derek Jeter's cologne, like something, because every single one of Jeter's too old now, but whoever's the major sports figure at the time, I always, so I just kind of show the modern and ancient overlaps between the two. And then my colleague takes over for, where did we get the professional sports teams that we have today in North America? And they're actually from a Protestant context. The YMCA was a religious institution, and the whole idea around manliness and organized sports has some roots in Protestant traditions. So, can you talk about that? Cool. Yeah. And I'm teaching it next semester. No, next spring I'm teaching it.
I was going to put the
Lower that? Yeah, that might help. I put green on the back of some slides, black on the other. I never know the room.
Yeah.
And sometimes black shows up better, sometimes light shows up better, so I did both. Okay. Any other questions for me before I start? All right, so then our questions will all be about text and language from here on out. Okay, am I in anybody's way? You can see, okay? Okay, so the story of how we got to the Gospels. How did we get the story of Jesus' life that we have today? Does anybody know how we got the stories that we get in the Gospels?
Well, his disciples, his followers, or disciples of disciples sometimes.
Yes, yeah. And they told stories, passed it down. Okay, yep, so, yeah, please.
There was like a social construction or the community has to do with the construction of the narratives as well. It's not just one person writing
Everything
laptop,
down.
No, but it's like a communitarian memory.
Yeah, community memory. What did they think was important? The disciples remembering what he said and passing it down. Yeah, more or less. So you have Jesus speaking, and then he's crucified, and then afterwards, yes, these stories pass down, and then eventually somebody starts writing them down. So the idea is that Jesus, don't mind my Lego New Testament, gets it across. And so he'll, make these statements, and then hopefully people memorize them and pass them down. Okay, so we have to talk a little bit about the timeline. I have a couple slides backwards. The 4 and the 6 BCE should be the other way around. So there's a reason I'm in the humanities and not in math. But if we think about the timeline of early Christianity, Jesus is born, we think, sometime around 4 BCE. The reason it's not, there's no year 0, first of all, but the reason we don't think it's year 1 is because the calendar's changed so many times, including the emperor who was in charge when Jesus was born. Augustus added our month of August. Don't ask me about calendars. I've read the books. There's this guy named Feeney who writes about it. I have the book. I don't know what he's talking about. I just know that the days changed. It used to be around festival calendars, and the months were much longer, and now they changed. So whoever knows math better than I do has gone back and figured out that Jesus was born around 4 BCE. The Roman Empire is in control in that period, though. The first Roman Emperor, Augustus, is in control. We know that John the Baptist lived somewhere around 26 to 30 CE. We do know he's a historical person. We do know that he existed because an ancient Jewish historian named Josephus talks about him. And we don't have any reason to question the passages in Josephus. Josephus also talks about Jesus, but those passages we have good reason to suspect were added later because they're not in the same kind of language Josephus tends to use. They say things like Jesus was the Son of God, which Josephus probably would not have said. And so probably it was a matter of John the Baptist is mentioned. Why not Jesus? Somebody better go in and put P.S. and Jesus was important too. That's what. But we know John the Baptist existed. And Paul even talks about running into people who were followers of John the Baptist. We think Jesus dies around 30. And then we have this guy named Paul, who I'm going to assume most of you have heard of Paul. He was a Pharisee who went by the name of Saul. He has this experience where he sees the risen Jesus. And then he changes his name to Paul and starts telling people, oh my gosh, this Jewish Messiah that was predicted, he has come. We think he starts out around 35. What's key about this, and I won't be able to get into it too much, is that they never knew each other. Paul never knew Jesus. Paul knows James, Jesus' brother. He knows Peter, but he never met Jesus himself, except for the risen Jesus. And Paul uses this as his justification for his activity because he says, yeah, James, Peter, they knew him during his life. That's great. But I've talked to him more recently. The risen Jesus has appeared to me and told me what to do. So my intel is newer than yours. Paul, we think, is going around talking about this Jewish Messiah till about 60. Church tradition has that he dies somewhere in Rome. We actually don't know what happens to him. His letters just stop at a certain point. So Paul dies somewhere around 60, 65. Then the Romans go into Jerusalem and destroy the temple. There's a war against the Jewish people in Judea because they kept having uprisings, and eventually the Romans got sick of this, and the Romans, being who they are, go in and just raze the ground, kill everybody, put everyone into slavery, their usual thing. It's not until that war that the Gospels are actually written. Why then? It's a great question. And if this were a class I controlled all semester, I would dangle that in front of you like a carrot for weeks and weeks. But really it seems like, Jesus comes, he seems to be this Messiah who's going to defeat these earthly rulers. In this case, the earthly rulers are Rome. And so when Rome comes in to fight the Jewish people, it probably sounds or seems to them like this war that Jesus predicted, like this conflict that Paul is predicting. And then the Jewish people lose. And so at that point, it seems like people start to say, okay, now if Jesus had anything that was correct in what he said and what he taught, we better go back and look at what he said to see where we went so wrong, because we thought this was it and we lost. And so we need to sort of regroup. So let's take a look at what he had to say. But what do you do when you have this much time between when a man lives and dies and when you have these first accounts of what he had to say recorded? What's that?
The message gets diluted.
Well, the message, you have a lot of problems with the message, yeah. Diluted is one of them. Yeah, how do you know it's accurate? Because the other thing, for those of you who have read Paul's letters, does Paul give us a physical description of Jesus? Does he tell us any of Jesus' teachings? No, he's not worried about those things. They're letters. You know, he's addressing problems in the groups he's talking to. He's not worried about, you know, Jesus said this. And the one thing he says is don't commit adultery. Jesus said that. And he tells us there was a Last Supper. Yeah. Pretty much that's it. Because it's not what the letters are for, right? That's not their objective. So you can't look to those letters as giving us the information about the historical Jesus, because that's not what they're there to do. Paul thinks the world's ending. You know, Paul thinks that he's got to get everybody ready for this world, you know, cataclysmic event. He's not worried about Jesus said what, and what, you know. So that becomes a real problem after the Jewish War, because imagine for the first time today writing about World War II or writing about the Bee Gees.
30?
He dies around 30. Yeah, our earliest gospel is around the time of the Jewish War, so that's 40 years.
One Jesus, or how many Jesus?
How many?
Yeah, Jesus.
How many Jesus? How old was he?
No, how many Jesus? Just one?
Just
Yeah, just one.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Just one, yeah. So you have the earliest gospel about this guy written about 40 years after he dies, just that one figure dies.
Which where he born?
He's born in, we have no reason to think differently, in Judea somewhere. Nazareth seems fine, or Bethlehem seemed fine, you know, somewhere like that. We're not exactly sure, but the narrative tradition has that he dies in the eastern part of the empire. Yeah. And we don't know where the Gospels are written, by the way. There's tradition that Mark's in Rome and Matthew's from Jerusalem. And this is all 300 years later, 200, 300, yeah. And that's because these are the places, the cities where Christianity starts to really rise up, and so you need, like, you know, a good figurehead to go with your location. So if Jesus dies around 30, in our earliest gospel we think is around the time of the Jewish War, so 40 years later. Again, imagine writing about, you know, Elvis, the Beatles for the first time. Because our latest gospel, John, we think is written around the late 1st century CE, so like 120, 110, which is almost 100 years.
That's like a lot of generations.
Yeah, and life expectancy in this period is about 22 years old.
Oh, wow.
So you're talking 2 generations, yeah, because of war and epidemics and childbirth. I mean, if you made it to 30, they pretty much thought you were going to make it. Yeah, you'd gone through most of the diseases, you know, you survived, you know, you're no longer probably eligible to go, you know, to be conscripted into, yeah, you've had your children and you can pump them out, no problem, you know, at that point. You're expected to survive. But yeah, it's a long time. So if you have, you know, these figures trying to pass on the teachings of Jesus, this idea of oral tradition, you have a couple of problems. First, the gospel writers do tell us this is what they did. So this is the opening to Luke, and I put in bold here that he is talking about the events fulfilled among us just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So he does claim that this is his process. But then back to your point, if it's diluted, what are our issues with the concept of oral tradition being reliable and being something that we can feel secure that this is what Jesus said? The first is the game of telephone here. So when I teach my Intro to New Testament class, I usually have the students line up and I'll whisper, you know, one line from the Gospels, and it's never failed. It goes around the room, and by the time it comes back to me, it is not at all, yeah, what I started off with, yeah. Now, granted, I always pick something hard, you know, like but that's important, right? To pick something hard too, because a lot of scholars who try to figure out which are the words of the historical Jesus will say if it's difficult, it must be because people worked really hard to remember it. even though it was challenging. But when you play that game of telephone, it doesn't work. And people have biases and interests and reasons that they might want to change things too. So you're dealing with the frailty of the human condition in addition to the telephone. Then you have the issue of things being lost in translation. This is kind of yeah, a little bit of more of an obscure slide, but Jesus spoke, I'll have another slide that breaks this down, but Jesus spoke Aramaic. He didn't speak Hebrew, he didn't speak Greek. The Gospels are written in Greek. So no matter what, in the first instance, you have an active translation. Never mind through the oral tradition, which you'd have to have translation that way as well. But once you go from Aramaic to Greek, those aren't his words. There are some words in the New Testament when he raises Talitha in Mark 5. They say, well, Jesus said Talitha cum, and that means, rise up. So there's some words, but other than that, it goes from Aramaic to Greek. We also know when we have found old papyri scrolls, or these are called codices, they look more like our books today. They're sandwiched in, it's not just all New Testament text, it's the gospel sandwiched in with Plato, or with Greek novels, or with other stories people liked. So back to this idea that language and text, or sacred texts, that we have to think about what cultural cues were out there before the Gospels were written. This is part of it too, because we can see what they're being read with. They're not just being read with each other the way we do it now. They're being read in light of Greco-Roman philosophy, or in light of, say, the novel. And then you have the question of new religious movements too. What makes them attractive to people, or what makes them intelligible to people? So here's my Scientology slide, because that's one. It being Miami, it seemed appropriate to have, that's our new religious movement here. But how do you make these things intelligible to people and convince them that your new way is the right way? That's going to include all kinds of factors for us, including things like what's motivating the people who are disseminating the texts, right? Or how are they trying to make these things appealing or intelligible to an outside audience? So the issue generally with oral tradition, according to scholars, is, again, first, Jesus is speaking Aramaic. If you know the Gospels, he travels very locally. He's generally just in the Galilee, and then he makes a trip to Jerusalem. That's it. So there's a limited audience, a very limited audience. And his audience, are they scholars? Are they rich people? Sometimes. But are they educated? No, they're lepers and poor people and the sick, and yeah. And so these are not people who, are going to write it down after he leaves. They're not going to jot down some notes. They don't have that kind of education, which I'll talk more about in a minute. We also know between people like John the Baptist, there's a man named Honi the circle drawer who's difficult for me to talk about because they were all sons of God. They all had a special talent. Honi the circle drawer, his talent was he would draw a circle in the dirt and it would rain in that spot. So I always say, like, make it rain, and I think of something else, But he used to draw a circle in the ground, and he could make it rain in that exact spot. Or Theudas claimed that he was sort of the resurrected Moses, and he would go down and say he could part the Jordan like the Red Sea. So there are all kinds of people in antiquity and in this period and in this region who also claimed that they could heal people, that they could do these special kinds of activities. So he's not the only game in town, in other words. Then you have the disciples and Paul. And the problem there is literacy in the ancient world was extremely limited. I say here that around 100 BCE in the Roman world, we know that no more than about 10 to 20% of the males in the ancient Mediterranean were literate. That's generous, actually. It depends on how you define literacy. If you're talking about people who could actually sit down and do what you all do in your programs, study and read books and write papers, that's like 4% of the ancient world. 10 to 20% are people who could, say, sign their name on a receipt or, know enough to, like, write a legal document, which is very formulaic. But people who could sit down and write a story, very, very limited. And then I already answered the why now, but we also know the gospel writers didn't put their names on the gospels. Does anybody know how we got the names for the different gospels? They were scribal designations. The scribes were getting confused. And so they would say, okay, this one's Mark, this one's Matthew. They would pick a name of somebody in the text and assign that name. So these were just anonymous texts floating around. I can tell you that something like the story of the adulterous woman, do you all know that one, where Jesus intercedes and that used to be in the Gospel of Luke. It floated around there for a while. It wasn't there originally. Somebody wrote it in the margins. A scribe wrote the story in the margins, and everyone was like, oh, I like that one. So that one stayed in Luke for a while, but then they realized it fit better in John. So eventually it sort of migrated into the Gospel of John. But these were flexible documents. It's not like, yeah.
It's not Luke who wrote the book of Luke.
No, no. It's just a name that was ascribed to. Because Paul elsewhere talks about Luke, who's a physician.
Yeah, so why is the issue of Luke being a physician? Because when we read it with, yeah, he was a physician, he wrote this.
Well, the reason the name Luke gets attached to it is because there's some medical terminology in that text, but the earliest versions of the manuscript, there are no names on them. Yeah, they just were floating around anonymous. And that's actually another good question. Why are they anonymous? If you don't want credit for these texts and you want them to stand on their own as credible accounts of something miraculous that happened, you're not going to say like, and this is by Robin. You know what I mean? Like, we want credit now for things that we do because we get some kind of social capital from it. But that's not what these texts were for. They were just floating anonymously to let people know what happened, according to them. That was the strategy behind it.
And so the original, was it mostly prose or was it poetic as well? Or not?
No, it's mostly prose. Yep. Mostly prose, but a lot of allusions to the Greek novel, to Greek histories, and to this category of literature called paradoxography. Paradoxography was, we don't have really news of the world anymore. I'm trying to think of what would be, kind of like Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Okay.
So it would be like, you know, in this particular region, we know that there was they used to love to say, like, we know that there's a guy who's like 120 years old who lives in, like, so we still do this, you know, like, why do people in this particular village everyone lives to be 100 years old? It must be their diet. The ancient world, they did the same thing, you know, and they would have like, oh, I heard that there was a body that resurrected, you know, like, so I'll give you some more examples, but those are the kinds of literature that it looks like. So, let me ask you, what do you think of the oral tradition theory for passing down the Gospels? Do you think the story about Jesus is questionable given oral tradition? Do you feel like we can rely on how people have passed it down? Like yeah.
Yeah, I think we are the best people to answer the question because our tradition is oral.
Okay, yeah, no, so I want to know. Yeah, no, there's no answer here that I'm necessarily shooting for, so tell me.
Yeah, the African tradition is oral and it is not credible.
It's not credible.
It's because you hear this from, for example, I hear about my great-grandfather who had 76 wives from this uncle. The next thing I hear, he was diabolic. And next thing I hear, he was a great man. I hear conflicting stories. And this is supposed to be oral
Tradition.
stories passed from generation to generation. But being educated, I see so much discrepancy. I see so much contradictions. And yes, to an extent, it maintains the form.
Yeah.
You know, maybe the characters.
Yes.
It is definitely not credible.
Okay.
I would say so.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, I think we have to be to distinguish what we mean by oral tradition here, because this is not tradition that was passed down for 3 generations. This is 40 years. That's half a generation, and there are people who are still alive. This is something that's so important to the people who are telling it. That if you're saying something that is really very dissimilar from their experience, they'll be like, no, that's a lie.
Okay.
So I feel like there are checks and balances to protect the authenticity of what's really told.
Okay. Anybody else?
I have a question.
Sure.
Are they memorizing texts? Okay, so it's not like, because see, like in India, you would have like the Vedas, for instance, right? And so people.
The
would,
Hebrew Bible, yeah,
Okay.
the Torah.
Okay.
Yeah, you would do that orally.
But these are not at that. They're not canonized in that sort of way. So like, they're not.
Well, there are many, many more Gospels floating around at this period. These are
That's
just the
right.
4 that make it.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are the 4 that eventually rise to the top and start to circulate together, and it starts to make sense. The canon itself is not completely closed until about the 14th century. Our earliest copy book of the New Testament, called Codex Sinaiticus, contains texts that we don't include anymore, including the Shepherd of Hermas and Paul's epistle to the Laodiceans. We leave those out now because we realize, like, they're too late, they're not accurate, they're not really Paul. But yeah, there are other gospels. There was something called the Diatessaron that circulated for a long time, where someone took all 4 gospels and just kind of harmonized them to make like one nice clean copy. Okay. That one circulates for a long, long, long time. I think well into like the Middle Ages until it drops out. And then there's something called the Gospel of Thomas. I don't know if that one they found. Those books I showed, that was the Gospel of Thomas was found in there.
And I heard of Gospel of Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, Gospel of Mary Magdalene was recently discovered by Karen King. Yeah.
So I have a question, so when we had the Jain nuns come, the way that in India they did it was that, like the Vedas, for instance, people would memorize the text, and then they would, so there was a lot more integrity in those ones because they would memorize the text forward, they would memorize the text backward, and then it would be spread. But also, like, each letter and word were sacred too. Yeah. In Western Christianity, it seems like the language is not so critical because nothing is being preserved in Aramaic or anything like that.
Well, to the point about it being something that you'd want to preserve and securely. So something like the Gospel of Matthew keeps saying, as it is written, as it is written, as it is written, and then quotes the Torah. And so that's something you can rely on, right? Okay, like the Torah, we know, people know that by ear, right? And so Matthew will cite that over and over again. That's okay. That's sacred text. But are these sacred texts yet? No, yeah.
And I think that adds validity because the argument, well, we're talking about oral tradition, but that kind of belies some of the argument that there's no scribal tradition of the time because a lot of
there
the
is a
early
scribal
Christians
tradition,
are Jews,
right?
That got that kind of an education, and they were at least able. Well, I guess it depends on which scholar you're talking to. At least most people at the time were at least trilingual. And then if you're a trilingual Jew, let's say you're a Jew that speaks Aramaic, around Galilee, that area, you speak Aramaic, you speak Hebrew, there's no difficulty, translation issues I get, but no difficulty in saying, writing down the words. Because if you think about Matthew 5, these are not complicated philosophical postulations. It's blessed are the meek, I don't think that is something that's like so complicated that could not be translated.
Yeah, I think that you make an excellent argument, and I just only caution it to bracket is the second point here, which is so few people are, to make sure we divorce this from our contemporary ideas of what, say, schooling is. Very few people are getting the kind of schooling that you're talking about. So you do have to have that historical happenstance of someone, a scribe, who thinks it's important enough to talk to the people who were the illiterates around Jesus, because nobody's going to, there's no school that's mandated. And if you work in the field, if you're a subsistence farmer, you do not have time for school. Anybody here who's studied an ancient language or a foreign language, which I'm sure all of you have, you have to keep, we were just talking about, you have to keep up with it or you forget, right? And so that's the other problem with it. Jesus doesn't really show any knowledge of anything but Aramaic and some Hebrew in the Gospels. Paul doesn't know Hebrew or Aramaic, not meaningfully. He only knows Greek. And the Gospel writers only know Greek, except for the few phrases of Aramaic that they've heard. So in a way, you're both right? It's not a black and white issue in the sense that there has to be something that's passed down orally. Has to be, right? Because this is what they're telling us they're doing. This is what the text itself reveals. But then we're dealing with the fact that it goes through the human person. Back to the telephone issue, where even within the 4 Gospels, they don't all tell the same story. It's the same situation, but they tell it 4 different ways. Yeah. So now you're dealing with the different perspectives. You do know that there's a generational gap. You do know that people have different interests. And then the point that I wanted to bring up for today is that you have the issue that you're dealing with these high literate people writing down the Gospels who can't just write down something that doesn't have any kind of markers or touchstone with what literature is doing already in the age. Do you see what I mean? You have to put in some cues. that because this is literature. And the other thing we have to keep in mind, I'm actually going to jump ahead because I'm inspired by what you're saying to a slide I was going to show later. But history in this period, so let me go to this slide back to Luke saying he went to talk to eyewitnesses. This was considered the best way to write about something that had happened in antiquity. You try to go, they're actually, ancient authors are complaining to one another like, oh, so-and-so wrote a history, but he never leaves his library. Like, how good could that be? You know, like I actually went out into the field like a reporter and I talked to people and I got a sense of what's going on. But in antiquity, are there footnotes? No. Is there Google? No. How do you check one another, right? If someone says something that's false, how do you get the word out that this is false? Or that this doesn't, correspond to what I think happened? Now you could say there are a few ways. One is like maybe then the text isn't successful because the word gets out like this one's not accurate, right? So they could just kind of be use. The other is somebody can write a counter narrative. You have 4 of them in the New Testament, right? No, not exactly quite. Like even Luke says, many have undertaken to write an orderly account. Basically what he is saying here, and almost all historians have a preface like this on their histories, he's saying, I've read all the other ones, mine's going to be better. And it doesn't quite, but that's what he's doing. We like to think of these guys as all cooperating with one another, but he's like, I've read Mark, no, I'm going to write the good. And of all of them, he's the best writer, and he knows it. And he's had the most education, and he's read a number of novels, and he knows he's got a shipwreck nobody else has. He's got like all kinds of drama nobody else has. If you look at the Gospels side by side, the same passage, his is 3 times as long as anybody else's and has all kinds of embellishment. That can't all be accurate, even if he did talk to the eyewitnesses. And if we look at other ancient authors of the period who are also writing lives of people like Alexander the Great, like Romulus, like other great figures, they'll say things like, this is the life of Alexander the King and of Caesar. He's going to write about a multitude of deeds that are so great that, I'm going to convey it all to you. I devote myself to the signs of the soul in men, and by means of these portray the life of each, leaving to others a description of great contests. What he's saying here by talking about multitude of deeds, he's portraying the life of each, this is a very important preface. It is not histories that I am writing, but lives. And in the most illustrious deeds, there is not always a manifestation of virtue and vice, nay, a slight thing like a phrase or a jest often makes a greater revelation of character than battles where thousands fall, or the greatest armaments or sieges of cities. What he's saying is you can get a gist of what somebody is like with just sort of an impression, even if all of my facts aren't correct. Because this is the ancient world. We can't confirm every single fact. But if I tell you about little things about their character, even if it's not exactly true, so thinking about your grandfather, do you have a sense of who his character from this story? Yeah. So even if you go back and you sort of start peeling it apart and like, did this actually happen? Is this exactly what he said? Is this exactly the even if that's not true in the ancient world, that's okay. As long as you get across sort of an impression, that's all right. So talk to eyewitnesses. Do the best you can, but write the most orderly account. And that most orderly account might include a couple of embellishments. And it might include a couple of little extras along the way. Does that make sense? But in the ancient world, it's not the same. It's not like newspapers today where you must have 3 sources and must... But that's what we are looking for because that's what we're trained to look for. In antiquity, not such a problem. Yes?
Thought or question, I'm not sure.
Okay.
The issue, one of the things that always strikes me about oral traditions is the fact that you're in a particular area or particular people that you're speaking to. Even when Paul's writing these letters, he's writing them. The substance is is basically the same, but he's addressing different issues.
Right.
So this is also a way to address what may be going on in a particular area that is either should be discontinued
or important to them,
or incorporated because of the relevance that it has to them.
Yes.
So even in that, there's that sense of, because at this point there is no cohesive message. I mean, there is no one written, this is it, and especially like from...
No, it's
from
developing.
Islam, it's doing another thing. And along the lines of what was being said about the changes in old tradition, I mean, from Santeria here in Miami, it depends on what house of the Santero you're going to.
Okay.
Because there's not going to be, even though it is an oral tradition, it's been carried down generation after generation.
There's going to be a different inflection.
But there's going to be a different inflection because of the particular house that you subscribe to, which has the lineage.
And if that one happens to get written down and passed on.
Exactly.
I see. Yeah.
So, and even in, even in Africa, you will have different, the same message, sort of say, but you have different areas. So each one of them is going to address it in a different way.
Yeah.
And emphasize some and downplay others.
Right.
And then address certain issues that may be pertinent to living next to this, but not if you live in the mountains or
Yes.
if there's a sense of women getting too much power or women not getting enough power or men getting, you know what I mean?
Yes. Well, this becomes the problem, and this is what people in my field do, is try to figure out, can we see those seams? Can we tell what was important to the person writing this and why they're writing this particular version of the story? Or why do they select this particular story? What the trouble is that if people want to use this text to say, this is exactly what happened, or this is, the sacred word that must be followed, but without awareness of the contextual nature of that message, that's where we can get into trouble. So oral tradition is sort of the trickiest thing because you do know some of this material had to have been passed down. But which parts, right? Which teachings? We know adulterous woman didn't happen. We know that one didn't happen. It's way too late in the textual tradition. It's clearly a scribe. It's not in the same language, like it's Greek, but it's like too well done. It's a scribe who's highly trained. We know that that's not something that happened, but it was a really good story. And back to Plutarch, I've never seen a Jesus movie without that story, right? Have you ever? People love it. Can't get enough of it. Everyone loves a good prostitute story. and we were really lacking a good prostitute story in the New Testament, So like somebody wrote it in, and it's stuck. Is that the worst thing in the world? No. As long as we can live with the idea that maybe it didn't actually happen. Or maybe something happened that was sort of like that, but it gets Jesus's personality across anyway, right? Or some of his message across. So what we have to do, especially if we recognize that these gospel writers were writers, one way to get at how do we see the seams is let's look at the literary tradition that predates the Gospels. Do we see any themes that they share that we know predated the Gospels? And this is also the case with material culture, if and when I get there. But what do we see that predates the Gospels that we can rely on as what's called a topoi? So a topic that people liked, that they were interested in, that was compelling, that we know that the Gospel writers borrowed from, not because they're inventing something and it maybe didn't happen and we need to have like this, nefarious, so critical to the point of being dismissive. But to say, back to that Plutarch preface, what did they sample from that was already in that literate culture to help convey the essence of who Jesus was and his message? So I'm going to jump ahead again because 11:20 we were going to go to. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead. But I've uploaded the whole PowerPoint so you can follow lots of pictures. Here's a couple of things I wanted to do. Like Luke is a historian, just quickly, to drive this home. And again, the reason I have this image is for those of you who know that every Christmas there's always the Charlie Brown Christmas. It probably has a name. Maybe it's Charlie Brown Christmas. I call it Snoopy Christmas. But when Linus gives his monologue about the birth of Jesus, there are only two Gospels with a baby Jesus. There's Gospel of Matthew and Gospel of Luke. Mark and John don't bother with a baby Jesus story. But the Luke one, back to the idea that Luke's the better writer, that's the one that Linus gives the monologue. That's the one with, the three wise men and the star. And anyway, but he does throw in a few facts in the storytelling that he thinks adds some flavor or some character to the story. So the first is, he says, in those days a decree went out from the Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. We actually know the census taking from the Roman world. There was no worldwide, I don't even know what that would mean, worldwide census under Augustus. We know that didn't happen. And he says that Joseph went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea to the city of David called Bethlehem because he was descended from the house of David. That would be going back 1,000 years of family lineage. That would be like, oh, I declare a worldwide census. Where was your family 1,000 years ago? Okay, now you got to get there on your own dime. For this, that never happened. No evidence that a census ever required travel. Joseph was not a Roman citizen. What are you taking a census for him for? Because census is for tax. He's not being taxed. So he wouldn't be a part of it anyway. He likely didn't own land. He's just a carpenter, you know. So he wouldn't have been part of a worldwide census if it existed in the first place. So no, you know, that's another Pinocchio. He went and registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was pregnant and expecting a child. Women were never part of the census. Why is he putting a heavily pregnant woman on a donkey and moving her 157 kilometers across the desert when she's about to give birth? I just had a baby. Don't do that. I'm lucky I made it in the car to the hospital, you know, like going over speed bumps. So don't put pregnant, you know, heavily pregnant women on donkeys and dragging them across the desert. Bad. But it's such a good story. And that's what I mean by conveying an essence, right? Like a worldwide census and they have to go and they're on the move, and that was great. You know, I like that story. Everyone likes that story. But that's what they're trying to do with that kind of preface. So if I jump ahead, I want to just talk for about 5 minutes about some of the literature we know that pre-existed the Gospels that may have been an inspiration for them. And then I want to talk a little bit about material culture. And then, so the first is there was a text in the 1st and 2nd century, we're not exactly sure when it was written, called the Satyricon. And it's basically like a joke book. It's a story of this guy who's kind of going through the empire and having all kinds of misadventures, running into all kinds of interesting people and learning facts about the territories that he goes to. And in one of the stories in the Satyricon, which we think predates the Gospels, he tells a story of a man who has a dinner the night before his funeral. So now if we look at the New Testament, we have a passage where Jesus has this Last Supper the night before he knows he's going to die. And he tells everybody that this woman had anointed his body beforehand for its burial, right? In the Satyricon, we have a man who thinks he's going to die the next day, has a dinner with all of his friends, and says that he starts anointing himself also with nard, just like Jesus does. Only 2 texts in the ancient world that use nard, too, for this particular purpose. And he says that he invites them all to his funeral and that they hope that they'll enjoy their meal as, you know, as much in death as in life. And he predicts that the next day, if I jump ahead, that he will be killed, and he asks his friends to divide and eat his body among them. So you know,
Which story came before which?
we don't know exactly. But we know that this is a topic in the ancient world that people like to play on. The idea that the night before your funeral, you have a meal with your friends, you anoint yourself, and you ask your friends to eat your body when you die. This already existed. So that's kind of like, so as a out in the ether story, we know this one already existed. You anoint yourself with nard, invite your friends to a dinner party.
Nard?
It's an oil.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And you tell your friends, after I die, I want you to divide my body and eat it among you. Already existed. If this,
So did it exist in Rome or did it exist in Palestine?
it exists, I mean, this story, we have copies of it all over the ancient Mediterranean. And if you're an educated writer, you probably know it. You've probably read it. If the Satyricon came first, then the gospel knows the story and may be reflecting on a trope, on a topic that's already out there. And people would expect that story to happen in the Gospels the night before Jesus dies because you see other kinds of literature do the same thing, and so you would include it. If the Gospel came first, the Satyricon could be making fun of the Gospels.
Okay.
You know, so we don't know which one. We know that theme was out there. We know that was already out there. The next one. Jesus predicts Peter will deny him 3 times before the cock crows twice. This is in the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And I'm breaking one of my own rules by putting too much text on the board, so sorry. The Satyricon. The night before this man dies, while he was talking about it, a cock crows. He gets upset and he pours some wine under the table because he thinks it's a bad omen, and he sprinkles it on a lamp, and he says it's not without reason that this trumpeter gave a sign, the trumpeter being the rooster. Someone close by will give up the ghost, kick the bucket. Someone's going to die, and before he could finish speaking, the cock was brought in, and his name was Trimalchio, ordered that they should cook it. So if this rooster's going to crow to signal somebody's going to die, then I better cook it because it's a bad omen. Yeah, but the idea of the rooster as the bad omen. or the omen that something bad's going to happen, especially around death. Already existed. And then this is another one I just mentioned, so you could see that this is what Trimalchio says at his funerary banquet. All of those who are beneficiaries in my will take what I have given only under the following condition, that they divide my body in parts and eat it in the presence of people. I advise my friends not to refuse what I order, but to eat my body with the same enthusiasm with which they cursed my spirit. But yeah, divide and eat my flesh. The other is the empty tomb. So, okay, you can still see it. Mark 16. So the women, this is Mary. I think it's two Marys and a Martha. They had been saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb? Because they know it's too big and they're going to treat the body, Jesus' body after death. When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for fear and amazement had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. There's a story in the Satyricon called The Widow of Ephesus about a widow whose husband dies. She locks herself in a tomb with the dead body. Right next door, a Roman guard is guarding 3 crucified bodies. He hears the weeping. He thinks it's a ghost, so he goes and peeks inside the tomb and he sees this woman. And he goes into the tomb to try to comfort her. Comfort in this case, because it is kind of a satire, takes a turn that you can imagine, okay? Without my saying so, because it is a comedy. So she gets over the death of her husband quickly. And so this Roman guard is in the tomb with her. They're eating and drinking and having a good time. While he's not guarding the crucified bodies, some people come and take one of the bodies off the cross. And so after the 3rd night, he comes out, he sees the body is missing from the cross, and he panics because he knows once the Romans find out that he wasn't guarding the tomb, guarding these bodies, he was in this tomb doing something else, he's going to be killed. So they take the body of the dead man, the husband, and they put that up on the cross. So as long as there's a body up on the cross, so now that guy's tomb is empty. And so then the debate is, oh, did that guy become a god because of the empty tomb? And so this theme of the empty tomb is something we see over and over again in paradoxography. So you have the widow of Ephesus, but also a lot of paradoxographical texts. And I just wrote down one that we know about, a story of a girl who dies. 6 months later, her family has a house guest. And she's cavorting with this house guest at night, 3 nights in a row. On the 3rd night, the parents catch her in the act, and they say, oh my God, we thought you were dead, like now here you are, you're cavorting with our, our guest. And she says, oh, you're meddling in my affairs, and your punishment is I'm going to drop dead. So she drops dead right there. They go to her tomb, it's empty. So the idea of the empty tomb is everywhere. Romulus, his body disappeared. I mean, there are something like hundreds of examples in the ancient world. The empty tomb, that stone rolled back, I have one more example from a Greek novel around the same time of the Gospels. When they reached the tomb, they found that the stone had been moved aside and the entrance was open. They were astounded at the sight and overcome by confusion at what had happened. This guy's name is Craeus. Searched through the tomb, he could find nothing. He looked up towards heaven, lifted his arms. Which of the gods is it then who has become my love rival and carried off Callirrhoe as his girlfriend, and is now keeping her with him against her will and constrained by a mightier destiny? It looks as if I have a goddess for a wife without knowing it. So the idea that the stone is rolled back and everybody's astonished and amazed and the body is got everywhere in the ancient world. So that the gospel writers use this as a cue is not too surprising. But if you're not looking for it to be to the letter accurate historically, it's okay, because you're getting across like, oh, everybody, I mean, it's a great story. Oh, who's going to roll back the stone? It's too heavy. What are we going to do? Oh my God, oh my God. The whole thing is just, you can get chills when you think about it, just like the way it unfurls. But we see this in a lot of novels and a lot of examples. Okay, so I want to talk about material culture too, to kind of drive this point home that there are things that are derivative and innovations. What does Jesus look like? I'm going to draw. Can I draw? Do we have markers somewhere? I probably have one. Oh, we do? Great. Okay. I got it. Okay, what does Jesus look like? He's got eyes. Let's start there. Okay, let's start there. I'll make him friendly Jesus.
Got a black hair.
Black hair? Is it long or short?
Short.
No, he's a Nazarite, right?
Yeah.
The Old Testament tells us of Samson who did not shave his head.
Yeah, you don't want to have short hair, right? Because,
So
yeah.
and I expect it to be dreadlocks because it would have locked if you don't shave your hair.
Okay, long dreadlocks. Okay.
Huh?
I mean, it's not like he's popping into the shower too often, too, you know, to like get the spa treatment. So, yeah, he's going to be a little dusty for sure. Oh, yeah, I'll give him a neck. What else does he look like?
He's black. Because he went to Egypt, and if he went to Egypt,
So,
he would definitely not look anything different from the Egyptians.
Right, he's not a white guy.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah,
what I'm saying.
yeah. There's no good way for me to do that. I mean, here we go. I'm gonna just try to. But he's darker. He's not going to be a white guy. What else? Doesn't quite look like Jesus.
He has beard.
Yes. Okay. Mustache too?
Yeah.
Okay. Just make sure I get that right. Oh, my terrible drawing skills. Okay, so he's got a beard. That looks a little bit. What else? It's more or less long hair, beard. Yeah. Yeah, he's got a. Here, I'm gonna make him even happier.
he's very happy.
Yeah. Okay, little happy Jesus. And toga probably of some kind, right? Like flowy. Okay, let's let that be our. So would you say this?
Jesus.
Yeah, is that what when Jesus is in your mind's eye? Close.
Open.
Okay.
Last I open.
Well, in the last class, we showed the guy did a black. He showed a black like a.
Yeah.
Jesus had looked.
Similar with the
Caribbean,
the,
yeah.
the Caribbean.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So iconography, where yep.
Yeah, but
Which is kind of
Professor,
interesting.
may I ask what's
Yes.
what's different in Jesus and God?
Ah, that's an excellent question. If you could bracket that, I'll get to that actually.
Different.
In the Greco-Roman world, not so much.
Mhm.
So I'll show you in a minute. Actually, you've anticipated something that I'm going to talk about. So more or less mind's eye. I mean, yeah, long hair, beard.
Like that, like that, yeah.
Long hair.
Can you describe what you see in this image to me? You've got a whole bunch of Latin. Here, I can even give you the Latin. It's a grave marker. I can tell you this is one of our earliest images of Jesus.
No way.
Yeah.
And he looks more like those Roman emperors. On
He looks exactly like the Roman emperor. Short hair. I can't quite tell if that's just like a chin or if he's got a little bit of hair there. It's hard to tell. But he looks pretty clean shaven. He certainly doesn't have the big beard. His feet are in this position where he's got one foot like this. This was common for the emperors, like going up to heaven, like he's 1 foot on his way up. What's going on here? What's in his hand? Well, he's raising Lazarus. Yeah, it is a mummy.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
mummy, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but what's in his hand?
A magic wand.
Yeah, yeah. Earliest images of Jesus, he's got a magic wand. Yeah, and there are other examples from the catacombs too with the magic wand. Moses has one when he's striking the rock. I don't know if I did put it in this PowerPoint. Moses has one striking the rock. But I love, whenever I go to a museum with early Christian art, I'm always looking for the Jesus with the magic wand. So you can see here's another raising of Lazarus where he's got but also notice, how does he look here?
Yeah.
He's got short hair. He looks like a Roman.
Right.
He looks like a Roman authority figure. And he's got the little, here's another one. I like this one, he just looks bonk. It's kind of a hefty wand in this one. But look at him there. He's got longer hair, but he's clean shaven. He doesn't look very much like the other Jesus that we've seen. Here's another early Jesus. He's got longer hair there, but clean shaven. He's actually blonde in this one. And then here's another one where he's meeting the woman at the well. Who does he look like? He looks like a Roman emperor. So here I've got, Yeah, this is Augustus here. And then this is, I think, Tiberius. But all the Roman emperors kind of look the same. They just kind of changed their hairstyle a little bit. But he looks just like, I always say it's like the Russell Crowe gladiator. Like he's got the Russell Crowe gladiator, clean shaven. But even his facial structure, he looks like one of the Roman emperors. And notice the foot here is the same kind of foot on the way up to heaven. So I show you this because, and I can see that my time's growing short, but I wanted to show you a couple of examples. When does Jesus start to look like, let me go back to this, and this is your point here. He starts to look a little bit more like a philosopher after a period of time. Yeah, so philosophers, here's Socrates, here's Epicurus, they almost always have, yeah, a beard. They look a little bit older. Oops, sorry. And then he starts to look more like, let me see where I have it. He starts to look a little bit more like Jupiter at a certain point. He starts to look like Zeus. Yeah. Then even in, say, like mosaics where he's at a throne with his arm, he starts to look a little bit more like Jupiter. Or sometimes, the body position, he looks a little bit more like Claudius here. And I should have a couple of others. But he starts to basically look like what you would imagine. Zeus looks like what you might imagine God looks like. So if you imagine that you have a high god, Jupiter, Zeus, in the Greco-Roman tradition, and the Jewish tradition, you have Yahweh. Yahweh's not supposed to be depicted except when he is.
How often was he depicted in the ancient?
We have some mosaics like, I think is it Beta Alpha, where he looks like a sun god.
Okay.
Yeah, he looks more or less like the sun god. He looks like this. This is Jesus in a chariot as a sun god, but he's also clean shaven there. But so here's one, for example. This is supposed to be Zeus. This is supposed to be Yahweh. But you see, like they have the zodiac around him, and he's on this charioteer, but he looks like the sun god. So whenever you depict Yahweh, which you're not supposed to do, but except when they do it, when Yahweh is depicted, he looks like Jupiter or Zeus. And then, when Yahweh is depicted, he looks like Jupiter or Zeus. Or he looks like the sun god. He looks like Ra, the Egyptian sun god. And so then Jesus starts to morph into either the philosopher or into Jupiter. But our earliest depiction of Jesus, no, he looks like an emperor. So this is what I mean by, these are all derivative and innovations on themes that already exist. So whether we're talking about the earliest depictions of Jesus, where he looks more like the ideal Greco-Roman, male who looks like the emperor. By the way, that image of Augustus that I showed you a moment ago, here, it's called the Prima Porta. He dies when he's almost 80 years old. He never released an image of himself that he looks older than this. He looks about 30 years old. 30 was like the sweet spot in the ancient world. So he never looks older than that. But he starts to look, he looks pretty much like that ideal, Greek or Roman male. And then eventually he starts to take on, this more of a depiction that looks, again, a little bit more like this. Sometimes he is looking more like Dionysus. So it's a different theology with each one, but it's drawing on pre-existent themes. So whether we're talking about narratives and talking about the novel, or talking about Greek and Roman histories that indicate something like the empty tomb, or we're talking about these examples from material culture, we can say with some security that they're drawing on these pre-existent. I even have one here. This is Paul. Can you see what he looks? I teach this in my Roman religion and sports class. He's naked. And he's an athlete.
Paul?
Yeah, this is Paul as an athlete. See how it says Paulus there? He's holding the victory, like the Olympic victory wreath here. Yeah. Well, not a wreath, but it's a reed. And he's naked and he's all jacked up. And he looks just like some of these. Yeah. So whether it's Paul, whether it's Jesus, they're drawing on these pre-existent motifs. If we needed to, I also had the Christian or not game we could play in the catacombs, but I'll hold that for later. But it gives you an idea of how these narratives, again, they're culturally coded, and whether they're in literature or whether they're in material culture, we can see that they're deriving from something that pre-existed. So,
amazing. Thank you so much.
No problem. All right, so I can take any questions that you have.
I have two.
Sure.
One of them relates to Moses with the wand.
Yeah. You want me to go back to that?
Story, doesn't he have to hit the rock with a rod?
Yes.
So
that works.
So
And then the
You're
rock
saying that
follows
people
him around.
interpret it as a wand, like that God commanded him to use a wand, or is it just?
So the wand idea is that whenever you do something that's kind of supernatural, there should be touch involved. So he hits the rock, and there's something that happens when he translates, that power from himself to that image. So when you have Jesus with the wand, it doesn't say, to my knowledge, in the Gospels that he whacks the leper with a stick. You know what I mean? Or that he hits Lazarus with a stick and wakes him up out of the tomb. So the idea is that you're drawing on that same idea that so here he's doing something supernatural. So the idea that supernatural activity would be translated either through some medium of touch. So whether that's through hands-on, the god Asclepius, who is the healing god, when we see iconography of him, he has his hands on somebody to heal them. Or you could do it through touch with what I'm calling here a magic wand, to just sort of play fast and loose with what it looks like to us. The other pre-existing cultural narrative is medical school. So in medical school, you would have kind of the icky corpse over here, and you would just point to things that you wanted people to pay attention to. So the idea that Jesus is sort of able to do supernatural things, or is sort of like an ancient physician, that it's playing on all these codes. Moses and the rock, and the medical school imagery, or Jesus.
This is the one thing. It's something in the African culture too.
Yeah.
We have what we call ofo. I said when you're a priest, there's a stick you hold.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes.
Really?
It's a divine stick. It's called
Somebody needs to go into early
it's called-
Christianity.
it's called ofo. And it's divine. The priest is only a priest who
Can
holds
hold it?
Yeah, or some people who have been elevated to become
Christian priest?
No, traditional.
traditional priests. So they hold it, and it has power. In fact,
And it translates the power from the priest, or it has power in and of
it
itself?
has power in itself, and if someone who shouldn't hold it touches it, there could be problems.
Really?
Yeah, like my great grandfather who had 70-something wives, he's the stick is because he is the king, and if I become king, that stick will be given to me.
Ah.
The staff of hope.
Yeah, so and it has power. If it's missing, people begin to die in the community.
Actually, I never really noticed this. Jesus doesn't have a stick here, but Jupiter has one in this image too. Yeah, so the idea of this, just having, when we say magic wand, we mean a lot of things actually, but this idea that you would have some instrument that has supernatural power. And so we can see from, iconography that Moses has the same thing, or the medical school, but also, if you're in a position of leadership, you may have a staff of some kind. Yeah. And so it's always surprising, I think, to people when I show, Jesus holding a magic wand, because we don't expect that. Except then you think about these translation fables that I call, but you can see that this has all kinds of meaning. It could mean a variety of different things, but that it's an instrument of power. She had one more question in it. Yeah.
No, there was a comment about the stick.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, please.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But no, I think that the meaning of the stick is always signified nowadays as well. For example, I don't know here, but in Argentina, the new president receives, I don't know how to say,
Like a sash?
like a sash and a stick.
Really?
Yes.
Oh. Yeah,
It's a symbol of power, of royalty, of
we've lost the magic stick, I guess, in modernity and the state. Yeah, I don't know if that's something I want to come back. So, that's very interesting. Yeah.
And then the other one was, you mentioned that Paul didn't know Hebrew or Aramaic.
Not meaningfully.
Is that, scholars got to that conclusion because the Gospels, or not the Gospels, the letters are all written in Greek? Or
Yeah, you're...
he was a trained Jew, and I would assume that he knew the language.
He's fully Hellenized. He demonstrates in his education only evidence of having been trained in what's called paideia. And paideia is Greek schooling. So if he knows Hebrew, he tells us he's reading the Torah through something called the Septuagint. The Septuagint was the Greek translation of the Torah. If he knows some Aramaic or Hebrew, he's being exposed to it some point in his past, attended synagogue, heard it read in Hebrew, something like that. But in his own letters, in his own testimony, he is saying, I'm fully Greek.
Wait, so what did Jesus read when he went to the temple?
He didn't read. I mean, the story may say, like, I know that he's 12 years old and talking to the teachers. It says that he can write in the ground, I think, in the Gospel of John. Yeah, if he's writing in the ground, I think the presumption would have been Hebrew. But he's speaking Aramaic, and he's not writing anything down for preservation in the Gospels. So if we imagine, so the argument here, I talk to my students all the time. If he's the Son of God, he can do whatever he wants, right? He doesn't have to go to school, right? Exactly. Right. So he can speak. Yeah, he could come down right now and talk to us in English, and it'd be fine. So if he's truly the Son of God, no problem on the education front. If we're talking about the historical Jesus, the man who was born, in Judea, someone in his social standing, what would he know? He would probably know a little bit of spoken Hebrew, but he speaks Aramaic. That's where he's from. And so it's a very sloppy comparison, but it would be like, Cubans. When I moved here, I had studied Castellano, and so then I'm like, I'll go to Miami, I'll be able to speak Spanish. And then I was like, what? I'm never going to survive because I can't understand the Cuban Spanish. So Aramaic is sort of like Cuban Spanish to, it's a sloppy comparison, but it's close. Yeah. And so he speaks Cuban Spanish compared to the Castellano, right? And so, he could probably muddle his way through. But is he bothering to read? Why would he? But the infancy Gospels, like the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which did not make it into the canon, he's smarter than his teachers. And so as you would expect from the Son of God. So there's the Son of God argument, and then there's the, what would you expect from someone of his social standing? Someone of his social standing, a historical figure, is only going to know Aramaic, and that's it. Maybe be able to identify some Hebrew. You all know some Latin if you go to church, because sometimes things are spoken in Latin. He would have known as much Hebrew. Do you know what I mean? You're all exposed to, so it would have been the same thing. But Paul, everything in his letters demonstrates training in paideia. And again, by his own testimony, he's not reading the Hebrew scriptures in Hebrew. He's reading them in Greek. And so he's probably had some exposure to it, but even when he says, such and such means this in Aramaic, it sounds like somebody's saying, I've heard this somewhere, and I'm going to include it to show, my education, but I don't quite know what I'm talking. He just kind of includes it, but his own training by his own testimony. But most, I think, church settings believe that he knows Hebrew. I've been, students have taken me to their churches, and I've heard sermons, and the priest will say, or the pastor will say he knows Hebrew, and it's not from scholars, our assessment. So there's a little bit of conflict there.
We have a question, boys, for Professor Ifa.
Okay.
Yeah. Where is the place of these inconsistencies in Islam?
Oh, that's a good question.
Because Prophet Muhammad actually used a lot of these same narratives.
Right.
So it's supposed to be oral tradition, right?
Right.
So where is the place of this? I know I've seen Abraham Geiger who said Muhammad was a very good plagiarist.
Okay.
So where is the place of these things in Islam?
Okay, so I think a couple of things. One is I think that Muslims would have no problem with what Dr. Walsh was saying. They would totally be on board because they're like, well, of course, that's the reason the Quran had to come, because it's just a whole mess of we're changing things and everything has been distorted, and there's truth in the Christian tradition, but there's just been a lot of changing of it, right? And of course, one of the big things is this idea of the Son of God, the Trinity. All these things are innovations that were included into the tradition, right? So the Quran, the idea of the Quran then being the final message that's supposed to correct the problems that were in the previous books, right? So that's how Muslims would understand it. Now the Quran itself then I think is a bit of a challenge, because Muslims don't subscribe to, generally in the Muslim world, they don't subscribe to the type of scholarship that's been done on the Bible in terms of the Quran, right? So the Quran is a much younger text. One of the sayings is that Islam was born in the full light of history, right? In a different sort of way. But but we have some old texts of the Quran. So there are a couple texts of the Quran that exist. The oldest is in Yemen. There's one that was recently found in Birmingham in the UK that dates to about 100 years before 100 years after the death of Muhammad. So I think with the Quran, there tends to be a lot more. So there even within the Islamic tradition, there was a belief that there were 7 harfs of the Quran. There were 7 variants of the Quran. So even during the lifetime of the Prophet, there were 7 essential dialects of Arabic that the Quran was being read in. And what happened is that during the time of the Umar Usman, the third caliph, then a codex was created, right? And this then became the Uthmanic Codex, and it was the standardized version of the Quran that was then went to different places. So we have fragments of the older codexes, right? So you did have in Arabia, you did have inscriptions that existed even before Islam. So you have Southern Arabian languages, and you have sort of rock inscriptions that still exist until today. So a lot of archaeology is being done now in terms of trying to figure out the same thing, that the Quran doesn't come out of nowhere.
Right.
They already had linguistic traditions.
Right.
You had very important in Arabic is poetry. So pre-Islamic poetry.
Oh, that's why you asked me that.
Yeah, Jahili poetry. So poetry in Arabic is the highest form of the language, right? And so then the Quran then attempts to supersede poetry and says, actually, we're going to go beyond that and show that this is divine, that it's so amazing in terms of the way that the language has been assembled, that this shows its divine nature, right? So I think that's part of it, yeah. So, but I think the language itself, though, the language is sacred, right? So because the language is sacred, then the memorization of it is something that's like a critical part from its beginning. So even though there are changes in the codexes and stuff like that, even in the earlier fragments that we have, for the most part, it's pretty cohesive throughout history, right? You don't see like massive changes that are taking place in the 1400 years of history. So one is that you did have writing systems that were there, and the second is this memorization part of it. So in the same way, like for instance, the Hindu Vedas, for instance, right? So almost more than 2,500 years old, 3,000 years old, perhaps. But you have like from North India to South India, across linguistic traditions, across writing samples. It's actually pretty cohesive. It's like, how do you keep a text cohesive over 3,000 years of oral transmission? And part of it is that they had a writing system, and then they would memorize it, and various people would memorize it. They would memorize it front to back to front. They would memorize from the middle to the side. I mean, they would do all types of things in order to memorize the text, right? So the memorization of it was something that was important. But I think also the fact that there hasn't been the discoveries yet, archaeologically speaking. So Islam really develops in Arabia. And for a lot of different reasons, a lot of archaeological work hasn't been done in Arabia to excavate
political reasons.
For political reasons, right?
Yeah.
And then when you go to a place like Mecca, they bulldoze everything.
Yeah.
So it's not like going to Rome where there's ancient history and there's monuments and stuff like that. You go to Mecca, and for the most part, except for the Kaaba itself, every element of the ancient past has completely been destroyed. They've destroyed every building, they've destroyed everything, and they've created an entirely new modern interpretation of Islam, I think.
I didn't get a chance, but to your point, this is the earliest scrap of the New Testament that we have.
Okay.
And you can see the date, 125. Yeah. And this is found in a garbage heap somewhere in Egypt. Yeah.
What language?
This is Greek, but I can tell the person who wrote it knows Coptic as well, just from the shape of the letters, but it's Greek. Yeah.
So why So, I mean, in Judaism, the language is critical, right? It's a sacred language, Hebrew, and it's being memorized, it's being used. How come in Christianity that the sacredness of the language doesn't transfer in the same way?
The Hebrew, because everyone's educated in Greek.
Okay.
I mean, again, it's a Slav.
Also doesn't.
Aramaic was such a local dialect.
Okay, so that was important. Okay.
Yeah, and everybody's being educated in this Paideia.
Okay, so Greek was.
Yeah, so if you're a highly educated person, and Paul as a Pharisee is highly educated, his job is to interpret the law. So other people may memorize the law. A Pharisee is there to interpret it, because if you've read the Hebrew Bible, a lot of it is like how many tracts of land, but not everything is answered. So they need a religious specialist to go in and say, okay, I know these texts, I know a tradition that I can help you interpret what this means. And so that was Paul. Josephus is also a Pharisee. Actually, Paul is really our only surviving literature from a Pharisee, separate of this whole Christian thing. So he has been highly educated in Greek and Greek traditions. He's read the Greek philosophers. We can tell he knows the Greek philosophers because he's using their terminology. Our word for spirit, that we translate as spirit, the word in Greek, hold on one second. Does anybody know? Pneuma. How do you know that? That's great. So this is the word in Greek, pneuma. Do you know what it means? And
Spirit, wind, anything.
yes, that's great. I'm gonna lose my. Yeah, so we translate it as spirit. That's anything that's animate, anything that animates. Wind, waves can get sperm gets translated this way. When you're looking at medical documents talking about how do you ensoul a fetus, it's with pneuma, and this is a Stoic concept. Paul uses it this way. Like how else? I mean, we read it now like, oh, well, you get baptized and you get the Spirit. Okay. And we just go, yeah. Because it's been 2,000 years.
Yeah.
We're in a warm bath. We know. But if you're in the ancient world and he says, if I baptize you, you'll get the pneuma of God. Yeah, what in the world? Like I always tell my students, like imagine Paul knocks on your door and goes, hi, I'm going to baptize you in the sperm of God. Like what? You'd be like, what? But he explains it. He explains it through these Stoic principles. He's using, as I like to tell my students at UM, the best science of his day. He's that educated. He's gone to like the Harvard of the ancient world. He knows it, and he's telling, and so people want to hear it. And people are receptive to that message. Exactly right. Because what the ancients thought is, like I can see right now from behind your eye, when you see the palm tree sway in the wind, you see it's moving. You know the palm tree's physical, and you know something is moving it. It just must be a substance that's so refined, it's to the naked eye, we can't see it, but there has to be something there. There has to be something material, and that material stuff, because it's so refined and invisible, must be part of God. And so sure, when you realize it that way, being baptized in, the pneuma of God doesn't sound too strange, but we, translate it as spirit, and we have this idea of what spirit means, and But Paul's using all that terminology, and we know he's reading the Stoics, we know he's reading Plato, because that's how he knows this kind of terminology. The word for church is ecclesia. And we know that this in the ancient world, in the ancient Roman context, means like a voluntary association. So people who are willing to gather together to do good for everyone else. In the ancient world, there was no like fire department. You'd have an ecclesia that got together and agreed, okay, we'll be the ones who, if there's a fire, we'll come and help. If bodies need to be buried, we'll help prepare them and get them out of, the town so that nobody gets sick. Like ecclesia were people who helped everybody else in the community. And so when Paul uses this word, he doesn't have the word church in his head. He doesn't know that yet. That's what we're going to translate it as 2,000 years later, looking back. He just means a voluntary association of people who are going to do something for the greater good, right? So when you look back at the Greek, you can tell that these ideas are in their head, or in Paul's head, and that he's well educated in that area. So the Greek is, to make another sloppy analogy, English tends to be the dominant language of education.
Okay.
Greek was the same.
So in the Greek Orthodox Church, is Greek a sacred language?
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, to the extent that there are certain formulae that are important, yeah.
Okay.
But I don't know that Greek in itself is like a sacred language
Okay.
that must be preserved word for word.
Okay.
No more than any canon. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? I almost lost the microphone jumping up and down. This is the first time I've ever asked, does anybody know what pneuma is? And somebody answered. So I'm so thrilled. Yeah. Excellent. That's excellent. Yeah, no, that's wonderful.
So, you said that Jesus didn't read Hebrew or anything as well. So that would work under the assumption that Jesus was never educated?
Most likely.
Because I had once heard it explained that since Jesus' ministry started at the age of 30, it was because he had undergone typical Hebrew schooling at the time.
Okay.
That was the 3 different stages, and that's why when he came out, everyone was calling him Rabbi Rabboni. That's why he had the Shemika authority, which he would call people, follow me, and they would know it.
Yeah,
I
maybe.
might subscribe to something similar to that.
Yeah, we don't really, I mean, there are other texts that say that he was educated by, that he showed this, remarkable aptitude and intelligence early. So even though, Joseph is only a carpenter, they did put him into some schooling. We just don't know what happened to, I mean, the Gospels are intentionally blank. Has anybody read the Infancy Gospel of Thomas in here? The Infancy, this is the one where he's killing all of his friends. It's an ancient text that tries to account for this missing time period. And it does say that he's going to school and that he's being educated, but also that he's sort of learning to wield his power, sort of like an evil baby.
The Quran, Prophet Muhammad obviously read that scripture because he used this same analogy where Jesus killed someone. He used,
Let me
I
see.
don't know if I'm right, in Islam, where Jesus turned wood to a bird.
Yeah.
And,
Yes.
and where he mistakenly pushed someone who died or something.
I just get, yes, you're absolutely right. I just did a lecture on this, so let me,
Oh, okay. All right, good. All right.
I used the Super Baby comic books from the mid 20th century.
Oh, okay, okay.
But this idea, how do you discipline a God baby? Because, and then I put my own baby, because at one point Joseph he keeps killing all the kids. Exactly, like a kid pushes him in like the marketplace and he zaps him and kills the kid. Or, like if a playmate's mean to him, he like withers him like the fig tree. And so then all the parents in the village keep going to Joseph being like, could you please like get Jesus, he's killing all of our kids. And then when Joseph is like, Jesus, like, could you please, like stop killing all of your, and he says, or to his mom, or say like, don't vex me, like, don't test me, you're my stepdad, like, don't. So like, yeah, you have these, because I think my son especially gives me this look quite often. But, I just showed you that piece of papyrus, that's our earliest piece in the New Testament, same date as this. So you have people from the beginning trying to figure out how do we account for those intervening years? And yeah, you may have an account that says that he's educated, but it also says that he's like killing his friends. And then the story is actually a very nice one, because if you go through the sparrow incident where he's on the Sabbath, he makes some clay sparrows and turns them into real ones. He withers a child. A kid shoves him, he kills that kid, tells Joseph, you're not my real dad. He's got a bad teacher. They can tell that he's a divine being of some kind, but he's smarter than all of his teachers. When they try to put him in school, it doesn't work. He's smarter than everybody. There's nothing for him to learn. He's just like outsmarting all of his teachers to begin with. Then he starts resurrecting people. He starts to realize like, okay, people are getting mad. I better like, if I kill somebody to show them like, I better resurrect them afterwards. Yeah, and then he starts healing people. A friend of his starts to bleed from like chipping himself, and then he starts helping out around the house. The crop's not so good that year, so he multiplies the wheat. He starts helping Joseph at work. Yeah. In the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Yeah. So even if you have like a teacher, every time he goes to school, he's smarter than them, and he's kind of a jerk to everybody in school. So they kind of pull him out of school. Friend gets bitten by a snake, and he saves him. So you sort of see it's this cradle to grave biography. It's called erotology. So this idea that you see the character development of someone from birth to who the fulfillment of their character will be. So you do have like the little evil Jesus baby in the beginning, but then he starts to learn to wield his power more responsibly. And then you start to see echoes of the gospel story. So yeah, as early as 125, again, earliest scrap of the New Testament we have people trying to figure out what do we do with those intervening years. There was a big movement about 30, 40 years ago. People thought maybe Jesus traveled the Silk Road.
I've heard this.
Yeah, that Alexander the Great, conquered all this territory, supposedly to India.
Yeah.
Although my husband is Sikh and tells me, so he's from Punjab, and he tells me that the story from their side is like Alexander got to the border and was like, hi.
Yeah.
And they were like, hello. And he's like, you're conquered now. They're like, what? And then he kind of just like turned away and walked away.
Okay.
So like not really
Yeah.
conquered, but he made it all the way to India. So some people say Jesus traveled that route,
Yeah, right.
learned Eastern philosophy, and then that
came back.
Yeah.
I remember this. Yeah.
Yeah, this was a big move like 40 years ago.
Yeah, there's the one of Egypt too, because he went to Egypt.
Yeah.
He learned the Egyptian
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation about where did he learn? Did he go to school? Did he go to Egypt? Did he go to India? You know, where did he?
What's interesting is that there's so in the 19th century there was a Muslim like reformist movement called Ahmadiyya, and they believe that Jesus went to India.
Yeah.
And he's actually died. He's actually buried in India, in Punjab, actually.
No way.
Yes,
Shut up.
yes,
I can't wait to tell my husband this. Okay. Really?
Yeah, you should.
All right, we have to talk about this.
Yeah, okay, all right, we'll talk about it.
Yeah, because if you look at, sort of incidentally, but great Roman generals, if you look at annals of where did they die, they're all killed in what we would call like the Middle East.
Yeah.
Because there's an obsession with India in ancient literature and an obsession with the Middle East. They want the spices and the trade, but they're the best fighters. And so the Romans keep going in trying to conquer these territories, and they keep getting their asses kicked. And so the greatest generals keep dying. And so you just see this great struggle over this territory and an attempt to go back to that region that Alexander tried to make inroads into, but he could never hold on to. And that's what's going on during the temple destruction, by the way, is Judea keeps rising up too. They don't want to be, I mean, they're basically colonized by the Romans. They don't want to be either. And so they keep having these uprisings. But they're just, and you can understand too, just geographically, they're on the Mediterranean coast. You have to land there to get through there to get to the places you want to get to for the trade, like India. There's no other way to get to India. So poor Judea is stuck in the middle. And so that's why they keep having conflict with Rome. Yeah, it's essential to conquer that territory in order to get to the other places they want to get to. Yeah, because there are mountains. Otherwise, it was easier to go through. Yeah. Any other questions? I just do this all day long, so any questions you have, I've got. Any answers? Yeah. Anything else?
Any other questions?
Just a comment.
Sure.
I think obviously in ancient times, the process of writing were longer than today. But I think that we have to admit that today texts go through very similar processes, and there are no texts that are absolutely pure. Let's say, you gave us the example of newspaper, and sometimes you read two different newspapers about the same fact, and you have two very different stories.
Yeah.
Completely different. No, that you think, okay, but what's going on? And maybe it was something that happened yesterday.
Right.
No?
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting because sometimes we can think that this only happened with the Gospels. No, and it's not like this. I mean, it's like writing is a process.
It is, and human beings are messy.
Yes.
And that's the problem. So I think the stakes are just so high with the Gospels because we want to know. And if I go back to that previous slide where I had the timeline, the thing that I think is the most difficult for people to contend with is the idea that there's that much time between the events that happened and then any account of them, just because Paul's not interested in telling us. So when you think about that, you want to do anything you can to get something that you can rely on from that period. And again, my contention is that one of the only ways you can begin to do that is to look for the seams. And because it is a process, and we know these people are writers, we know they're educated, where do you see those seams from their education? Then if you can do that work and not be afraid of that, understand that people are messy, then you can start to say, okay, now, how do we deal with oral tradition? How do we understand individual communities having different ideas of what they want, then you can start to do that work. But first you have to remember that people are messy. Yes?
So how do we reconcile sacred text being divinely inspired with this?
I don't know. Is it okay to not know? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I guess it's how it's used, right? So I think if people, they make choices and they codify things in different ways and they use them in different contexts, and then how you use them determines. I mean, we've certainly stabilized them now. So if you want to say it's divine revelation and it comes to a certain point, then that's the answer. But from the historical point of view, it's much messier. Yeah. I've always, when I teach something like Intro to New Testament, I'm always scared because of that exact question. And I'm afraid that, my students who are training to become pastors, or when I did an MDiv, and so that was a scary question when I did my ministerial degree too. But I find that, when you realize that these humans, unfortunately we're the instruments of these things and we're messy, then once you realize that, then I leave it to those who have more training than I do on how to resolve the rest of the issues. But I've never seen it actually like ruin somebody's faith. If anything, strengthen it to understand the context and where it comes from. But I don't know. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to say about your question that we have to challenge our notion of authorship.
Yeah.
Because now, if you quote a sentence from another person, and if you don't say
plagiarism.
Yes.
Yeah.
This was completely different. No.
Yeah.
Generally,
No. Plagiarism
the
was
masters
fine.
Didn't write.
Right.
The disciples write. No. And yes, it was not plagiarizing.
No, there's no such thing.
There was a community way or a community process in the writing of books, and just from theology, we can say that maybe God was working there, no, in this process. We have the image of like the little bird on the head, overlook and look with writing there.
Yep.
But for sure, this was not like this.
You did field work.
Yeah. I always remember one of a professor I had. He taught us Bible and these things. He told us never thought about Luke and John in front of their laptops writing what they are watching.
With a professor grading it.
And they write on and they wrote in their laptops what happened. It was not like this.
No, it wasn't. And that's why I love this Plutarch quote so much,
Yes.
and I like to show it. Because this is really, I'm not writing a history in the sense of how we understand history. I'm writing a life. I'm telling you the story of a human being. And, it's not in these great deeds or like battles or in like the most amazing things that happen to this person. It's in those little details about their life that you're going to get a sense of their character. And, you see this I saw this, my husband was watching Antiques Roadshow before I went to bed last night. And there was a guy who said, oh yeah, I have this American flag. My father was at Pearl Harbor and he pulled this tattered American flag out of the water. And it's a Pearl Harbor flag. And like you could see this guy's like, oh, I'm going to get at least $250,000 out of this one. If you've ever seen Antiques Roadshow, you see these people like waiting, like, oh, mine's the $1 million. Turns out the father completely lied. This flag was from like after the war, like you could see there was a serial number on it. Yeah. The guy traced it. It's worth $300. Right. And then the guy's like, and if it had been a Pearl Harbor flag, probably $300,000, but unfortunately, like your father told you a lie his entire life, right? But this guy had this flag in his house, believed it was from World War II, and put all this meaning and symbolic weight on this flag, and had this idea that it represented something, and that was more, and of course he said the right thing, like that's more important than the money, but you can kind of see like, like this was a bad one, like this one hurt. Realizing my father's lied and I have no, this is an heirloom that's worth nothing. But the symbolic weight of it, right, meant so much more, and that's what we do, right? And so you see it in ways large and small, and there's no way, again, in the ancient world to fact check one another, really. You can go back and you can talk to the eyewitnesses, but notice in this preface, Luke is admitting he wasn't there, and that other people have written other accounts, and he's competing. This is a landscape of competition among writers. And he's just one of a number who are competing and trying to do the best work that he can. And he's talked to people who claim they were there. He can't be sure, but it's been handed on and he's doing the best job he can. He's going to write the better one. And maybe he did.
I have a question.
Yes.
I want to know and to make sure about the true story by Jesus. Because I know many stories. Because I want to think about the Jesus, the born and death, and it's true or fake.
What's the last part of your question?
Do you think about the Jesus,
Yeah.
the name of the he was born,
Yeah.
the year and
the date, yeah.
And the date. But I don't make sure. I don't know about, and this is the true story or fake story.
Just about the birth in general, or?
Yeah, for China. Because I have many documents. Because, for example, and the BBC News, I read many news about Jesus, but so they don't know about where is Jesus born. I think nobody knows year and to.
Yeah, no, and I mean well, I am not one of the scholars who think he wasn't a real person.
Yeah.
So he was born.
Yeah.
But how the birth story from the Gospels?
True story or fake story.
Well, first of all, the stories don't agree. This is another class I just taught. If you look at the infancy narratives, they don't agree at all, even about his genealogy.
Yeah.
So if I go forward here, there's my Alexander the Great. Let me see if I can. Here we go. They have a different genealogy. None of the details from Luke's. We know Luke's making up the census. He's making up who's in charge. He's got Augustus right. Quirinius was not governor at the time. He's got all kinds of things like John the Baptist, the pregnancy of his mother, Elizabeth. He's got a genealogy later, but the genealogy in Matthew goes through 4 women. Those are not present in Luke's. So even the genealogy is different. They're in different places, different leaders. There's a flight to Egypt that's not in, So we just don't. I mean, the 2 infancy narratives completely, they don't conflict.
Yeah,
but we don't.
The witness, the science, the witness.
Yeah, we just don't know who. Yeah, I mean, it's not. None of these gospel, we have no idea what happens to Mary, for instance, or Joseph. We have no idea. So it's not like Luke's gone back. Like I went back to Galilee and I found Mary and I said, "Hey, what was that birth story like?" Yeah, no, we have no idea. Yeah, we just don't have the data. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, there's this question I asked. It seems like you did not get it.
Oh.
I said Jesus read from the book of Isaiah.
Because the Gospels have him quoting it? Is that what you mean?
No. He reads. Luke chapter 4.
Actually reads the text out loud.
Yeah, like when he was uncovered before the people, he went and read from Isaiah.
Okay.
He read Isaiah 56.
Isaiah 56, yeah. Given unto me to free
the acceptable year of the Lord.
Yeah. So that's why I asked, what was the scroll in the synagogue at the time written in Aramaic, or was it?
It would have been in Hebrew.
So for him to read it, which means he knew some sort of Hebrew.
If you take that story as historically accurate.
It's possible.
Yeah.
Right now, some Hebrews that are claiming to be Jews, they can read Hebrew.
Yeah, he's Jewish. Yeah. He's a rabbi. Yeah, so this comes back to the story of we just don't know what he was doing before 30. We have this information, but otherwise we just don't know. So did he go to school and become a rabbi and can read Hebrew, and that's where he gets authority? Maybe. Did he go to the Silk Road and learn everything in India and come back? Maybe. Did the gospel writers make up that he could read because he's a teacher and they expect that he can read? Maybe. We just don't know. But that's the work. That's the work. How much of that is an oral tradition? How much is that invented? I mean, the idea that the philosopher would unroll the scroll and read from it, or the rabbi would read from it, that actually sounds like invention of a writer more than someone saying, oh, I remember he had this scroll that he carried around and he read exactly this particular passage to us, right? That actually does sound more like, if we're looking for seams, like the thing that you would expect a teacher to do, and so you better put in a scene where he reads a scroll. Do you see what I mean? Or you could argue that this is historical. Yes, he must have gone, from this one passage, I believe that this happened, and he must have gone to school and had this particular training, even though, that might conflict with what we see elsewhere in the Gospels. So you have to just be careful about how you lay out that evidence, and where are the contradictions, and where can you create those sense units to think that you're saying something that's historical. Unfortunately, the text doesn't tell us where he got that training, but if we take that passage as historical, that he must have been able to read, then you can draw some conclusions about his training.
Yeah, just to ask, was it traditional for just anybody to go to the synagogue and be given the podium to read from the Torah?
No, that would have been a religious specialist's activity.
So which means he must have been a trained Pharisee.
Oh, no, Jesus was not a Pharisee.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Being a rabbi.
So it was an
Yeah.
essential
The Rabboni just means teacher.
Teacher.
It just means teachers. So it doesn't necessarily mean like any particular training as a rabbi. He could have been a trained rabbi, but then why doesn't he have a synagogue of his own? Right? So that's the problem. So that's what I mean by you have to then start to mine historically, what does that mean? So to our best knowledge, he's a traveling teacher. And the word rabbi, rabbuni, means teacher, and so they just say like, you're teaching us, and so you're a rabbi. Does that mean he's formally trained? Maybe, maybe not. Because then you might expect him to have his own synagogue somewhere. But from this, he doesn't come from the kind of social background that would indicate that he would have that kind of training. Now, a Pharisee, like Paul, was a Roman citizen. You know, Josephus lived in the royal palace. A Pharisee was rich. A Pharisee was a citizen. A Pharisee went to school in their leisure time. Their leisure time wasn't helping out Joseph with the carpentry business or like being in the wheat field. You know, this is somebody who all they had to do all day is, you know, sit in the library. And that's where Paul comes from. Paul later says he's a tent maker, that he goes from town to town. But he's clearly doing that just as a subsistence thing, you know, to like get to know people. Because he can't just march into town and say like, I'm this wonder. Why would he be approachable? So he goes around saying he's a leather worker, more or less, and he's learned the trade. But if you think about social standing in the ancient world, he's a rich guy like Josephus, like Philo, like, you know, these guys who have time. Because think about just the money to have one more thing, I promise, and then I'll be done. But the scrap of the New Testament that I showed you, this was incredibly expensive. And notice there are no spaces. No paragraph breaks. This was so expensive to have a piece of paper that you didn't waste any space. You didn't even put paragraph breaks. You put a little dot, you know, like when you wanted a sentence break, but you would use both sides of the piece of paper and you wouldn't waste a thing. Because, so to even be Paul to have the money and the means to get a piece of papyrus, people complain in the ancient world that people used to write on like shards of pottery and like send it like postcards because they couldn't afford paper. So people would apologize like, hey, I'm sorry, I'm writing on this old piece of like pottery. I couldn't afford any paper this week. Well, how are you doing, Bob? Like, blah, you know, we have examples from the ancient world. So to have the money to even do this. Yeah, not even space between the letters. Yeah, I can, you know, someone might read it out loud anyway, so if you could read it, you don't need, but you still don't waste the space. You know, you don't do it. So it's incredibly consuming thing to do. So
Peter didn't write the book of Peter.
Peter didn't write the book? No. Sorry. I'm sorry. But the anonymous thing is kind of nice. I don't know about Peter, but the anonymous thing about the Gospels is, you know, they didn't want to put their name on it. They just wanted that story to be out there, right? And, you know, Luke says he's inspired by the word logos, which is another philosophical idea. You know, this idea that, you know, it's the word of God. You know, and so why claim credit? Yeah, and that's kind of a nice idea. And I mean, there are strategies behind it of authorship and but in terms of that social capital, these authors aren't trying to get that. So that's kind of nice.
I'm so sorry, but Peter actually, like, it says Peter, the apostle of Jesus. I just looking at it really quick here.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the other ones weren't. You're saying the Gospels didn't have a name, like an author to it, but Peter does.
Peter wasn't literate.
And the letter probably is.
Somebody put his name on it. Not all the letters in the New Testament that are claimed to be Paul are Paul. Yeah, no. They're actually very few. There are something like 27 letters or something. I don't know, I forget. But, yeah. Or someone took, like the letter to the Laodiceans that I mentioned gets taken out of the Shepherd. Actually, I have it right here. The Epistle of Barnabas, Shepherd of Hermas, were taken out. Laodiceans, I think, was also in Codex Sinaiticus. It was clearly just lines taken from other Pauline letters and strung together because Paul says he's in prison. We never had a prison letter. People thought we better include a prison letter. It's not Paul's words, actually. Someone just took like lines from Paul's other letters that sounded like he could have been writing from prison and sort of made like a Mad Lib letter, but everyone could kind of tell it was fake, but it was still Paul's words, right? But Paul didn't write that one. So yeah, people fool around with, but Peter's not literate in the gospel, I think, at any point, but also given who he was, a fisherman's fishing or, whatever. They're not going to school.
Except divinely inspired.
Right. That's the thing. Everything I've said today.
Actually, a woman that is not literate, but when she's filled with the Spirit, she can read the Bible.
Oh yeah, the ecstatic, and Paul talks about that. He calls them pneumatic demonstrations.
No. Excuse me, please.
No, but Paul talks about that all the time. He says that pneumatic demonstrations are happening. We don't know exactly what he means, but it could be something like that. So yeah, we just don't know.
There's several times when the Apostle Paul says in his letters that I'm not writing, Timothy is writing. I'm using an amanuensis. That was something that was common.
Yeah.
So even if Peter wasn't,
yes, he could have
particularly
dictated.
literate, yeah. So there's several times when that happens where the Apostle Paul was literate, but apparently for whatever reason he wasn't able to write. Even what we call the prison epistles, he would say that send this person to me. And obviously, it's that person that's writing the letter.
Yeah. Some people think it's because he's so rich, he has kind of like a secretary who's writing for him. Some people think it's because he's in. Yeah, we just don't. But yes, so Peter could have dictated it, but then you have to start looking at the manuscript tradition. Where does it come? When does it first come onto the scene? If it doesn't come in until the 4th, 5th century, then you start to think maybe it's not real. Yeah, it's a whole big mess.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me. It was great to meet all of you. Good luck with all of your studies. Yeah, this was really a lot of fun.